let's just go ahead and get started. Michelle and I have been really excited about this talk, and we really hope that everyone finds it helpful. And we thought that it would be best if we started by just briefly introducing ourselves and talking a little bit about our paths to kind of applying to and going to grad school. So my name's Allie Klein. I'm a second year at Case Western Reserve University. I work with Dr. Nora Feeney. My interests are primarily in optimizing interventions for PTSD and disseminating and implementing interventions for PTSD. And I would say that I had a relatively, at this point, what I would call traditional trajectory for applying to graduate school. So I had some really excellent experiences in undergrad with research. I pursued a senior thesis, which is really what piqued my interest in pursuing a career in research. And I thought I might be interested in PTSD and trauma. And so after graduating, I saw opportunities in that area. I got a job and worked at the National Center for PTSD at the Boston VA for 2 years after graduating on a national longitudinal study of vets from Iraq and Afghanistan. And I applied to graduate school in my second year of that position and then started last year. Michelle, you want to talk a little bit about your path to graduate school?
Sure. I had a much more circuitous path to graduate school. So as Allie mentioned, my name is Michelle Bovin. I am a staff psychologist at the Behavioral Science Division of the National Center for PTSD and an assistant professor at Boston University School of Medicine. I graduated from Temple University in 2011. And when I had graduated from undergraduate, I thought I might want to go to graduate school for psychology. I was thinking more of a clinical focus. And so I worked at some mental health rehabilitation centers. I then applied to a program in social psychology. Thought I was going to get my PhD in that. And as I started doing research in social psychology, I realized that I was a lot more interested in working with the patient population. Unfortunately, I realized that just as my GREs and my psych GREs had expired, so I had to retake those, and then I applied to clinical psychology graduate programs. So definitely more of a circuitous path than Allie took, but both led us to the program and to applying to graduate school and getting in. So hopefully we'll be able to give you some different experiences with our two paths.
Yeah, and as Michelle said, really the purpose of us kind of saying that up front was to kind of show that there's no one right way to pursue this degree. So let's get into it. So these are the questions that we're going to be hitting on today. We'll spend a little bit less time on the first two, which is a PhD in clinical psychology right for me and is now the right time to apply. These are more for people that are still on the fence about applying in general, and we're not going to spend a ton of time on it, but I'm happy to talk to people after the talk. You can shoot me an email. Our contact's going to be at the end if this is something you'd like to hear a little bit more about. But we are going to spend the bulk of today's presentation on really the actual application process and the interview process and the decision-making process, and hopefully that's helpful for people that are kind of starting to pull their application materials together. And then at the end, we're going to have about hopefully 10 to 20 minutes for questions. Like I said, we're going to use the chat function. If I don't get to your question, feel free to just email me. I'm open to talking more about this stuff. I know how anxiety-provoking and how tough this process can be, and having resources is great. Also, don't worry about writing everything down because this presentation is being recorded for later, and then these slides are also going to be available to everybody in your materials section on your webinar format. Okay. So I think we're all here because we are somewhat interested in pursuing a career in mental health, but there are a ton of different ways to go about that. And I'm not going to spend a lot of this presentation talking about these different degrees or really narrowing this down. Mitch Princeton's guide, which is an excellent resource for this process, you can find at the end of this presentation. He really goes into each of these different degrees and the differences and the requirements. We don't really have time for that in this presentation, but there are a ton of ways to have a career in this field. And we're really going to focus today on getting a PhD in clinical psychology. So this degree involves a multifaceted training approach. So in school, you'll receive training in research and clinical work and in teaching. And there are typically two models to clinical PhD programs, both equally weigh science and practice. They emphasize the importance of research informing clinical work and clinical work informing your research. The big difference is that in a clinical scientist program, the belief is that services should not be available unless they've been rigorously tested by research according to certain criteria. And I'm just putting this up here to show like there is an emphasis for research and clinical practice in both of these degrees. And that might not be something that's emphasized as much in some of these other degrees that you just saw up on the screen. So again, just to start thinking about what you want out of your degree and out of your schooling, you're going to get elements of all of this in clinical PhD. And I think in order to really decide whether this is the right program for you, you need to start to consider what your goals, your career goals, and your priorities are. And this is something I'm going to come back to again and again in this presentation because it really helped shape how I went about my decision process and my application process. And just to give you an example, my priority when applying to graduate school was research fit, but my family lives on the West Coast. That's also something that's very important to me. And so it really, and those were at tension a lot of the time. And so it really became about thinking about my goals for my career and thinking about my priorities in my personal life. And there's a push-pull, and sometimes you have to make a sacrifice. So that's going to be true kind of across the board as you're deciding whether this is the right degree for you, as you're deciding on which program is the best fit for you. So I would really encourage you to just start thinking about the things that are most important to you as you pursue this degree. And I think some ways to start thinking about that are to answer these questions. So if all these elements listed in this first question, so research, clinical work, teaching, supervision, these are all going to be elements of a PhD program in clinical psychology and will be involved in your training in some way. I don't think right now you need to know, like 10 years from now I want to be a researcher, or 10 years from now I want to be a clinician. But if you're feeling that you want to enter this degree, you should be comfortable with all of these making an appearance in your training in one way or another. So just for example, if you're thinking, well, I really hate research, I really don't want to do research, it's going to be a huge part of your degree in a clinical psychology PhD program. So just to start thinking about that. What setting do you imagine yourself in? One of the big reasons I ended up selecting this degree is because you can be in so many different settings that include different elements of research and practice. What do you want your salary to look like? Typically, people with PhDs do make a little bit more money, but that's often at the expense of spending more time in school, which brings me to the next point. So again, it's back to priorities, and it's about your life circumstances. So if you really want to finish a degree and be practicing right away, this might not be the best degree, but you need to balance that with your other interests as well. And then are you willing to move for school? We'll talk about this more too, but a PhD, you're really applying to the mentor and not as much the program or location. So depending on your interest, there might be a really limited number of people that you can actually apply to, and you might need to move. So that's something you need to decide too, how that fits into your different goals. And then how much money do you want to spend on school? Typically, even though you do make a salary later on as a PhD, you also don't have to pay as much for school. And you do get a stipend, but the stipends are not often as much as a full salary, and sometimes people do take out loans to help with cost of living expenses. So just to kind of sum that up, these are just questions to really get you to start thinking about, if you haven't already, and I know probably a lot of you are already saying, yeah, I thought about this, I already want to do this, but for those that are on the fence still, again, just starting to think about your priorities and starting to think what you want your life and your schooling to look like is going to be really important. Which brings us to, is now the right time to apply? As you're all probably very well aware, these programs are becoming increasingly competitive, and research experience and developed research interests are a huge part of the application and interview process. It's really starting to become the rule rather than the exception that people are taking jobs right after graduation instead of applying straight through. And I think if look at these next set of questions, if you can say, like, I have developed research interests, I can speak about them in an informed way, I can speak about the literature, I have research experience in this area that is applicable to what I want to do. You know, conferences and conference presentations and peer-reviewed publications are becoming a part of the process as well. Do you have those kinds of experiences? And then the last two I would say are really about your role in graduate school. Are you prepared to start seeing patients as a therapist? This is a huge responsibility. It's a huge undertaking. And I know personally, I definitely needed the time off to have a better concept of mental health and to grow a skill set and to work with that population a little bit more. And then are you in a place in your life where you're able to take on a lot of responsibilities? So just for example, just next semester, I'm working on my master's, I'm in a full course load, I'm at placement, I'm seeing patients, I'm working on lab research projects. So, and things only get busier and crazier. So, and it's definitely different from undergrad in that it's much more like a job, I would say. You know, show up, you do your work, you're in your office, you're going to class. It's a really serious, the training's really serious. So I think, again, are you ready for that kind of experience? Michelle, did you have anything you wanted to mention with this?
Let me just ask a technical question. For me, it sounds like you're breaking up a little bit. I'm wondering if others are having those issues. I know everyone's muted, so they can't answer that.
If someone can chat me and tell me if they're having a hard time hearing you.
Okay. And in the interim, I wanted to sort of just build on what Ali said. I think she's presented the questions to ask yourself very well. And I think it's important to think about, you know, you don't have to be 100% ready to do any of these things, right? You don't have to have a fully developed research program in your mind. You don't have to be 100% comfortable seeing patients. I was very nervous the first time I saw a patient, and that didn't mean I wasn't ready for graduate school. But it's more a matter of, am I prepared to sort of deal with that, some of those anxieties, and move headfirst into it anyway? Do I have enough of an idea that I'm ready to mold into something that I will eventually be able to stand on in terms of either my research or my clinical work or both? And Ali will talk a bit more about that balance, but I really think that that's an important piece to keep in mind.
I totally agree, Michelle. Is this a little bit better? I'm leaning in closer to the speaker.
Seems a little better.
Okay. All right, great. So if you're answering those questions and you're starting to think about them and you're thinking to yourself, I am totally not ready to apply, that is totally fine. And if you're also thinking you are really interested in seeking one of those post-bac research jobs and don't know how, these are just a few different resources. You can always browse university and hospital job searches. You can directly reach out to faculty that you know that you're interested in working with or that have are doing research that interest you. And that can be at a university or a hospital setting. And then getting involved in organizations like ADAA and networking about potential lab opportunities. And what I will say is, you know, if you can't find a full-time position right away, I wouldn't be discouraged, and I would even consider volunteering somewhere for a couple hours a week. It will just increase your application and your skill set and make it easier to apply for a job down the road a little bit. And I think, just to share a little bit about my experience, I believe that I responded to a posting from a conference organization, and that's how I got my job after undergrad. So now we're really going to get into the meat of the presentation, which is kind of preparing your application, reaching out to potential mentors, and all of that. And I imagine this is where the majority of the questions will come from. But again, just save those till the end, and you can go ahead and type them in your chat box. So essentially, for all clinical PhD programs, you're really applying to the mentoring of the program. And what that means is that you're not going to be applying to all of the top, quote unquote, top programs. You're going to want to have a varied list in order to increase your chances of getting interviewed and getting accepted. And your choice should all be about fit, research fit, but clinical experiences, mentorship fit, and we'll talk a little bit more about kind of seeking that out and identifying that. So you want to start by making a list. You'll browse different faculty profiles and university web pages to see what people are working on right now. Think about articles that you've read in the area that you're interested in, and who the authors are, and whether they're on academic campuses or not. We've talked about this briefly, but you can base your list on location. This isn't recommended, but sometimes obviously there are life constraints, and this is how you need to prioritize things, but it can be challenging to ensure that you have a good fit if you're only basing it on location. And then talk to people that you know in the field, your different mentors or bosses who can help make the decision. My boss at the VA was incredibly helpful with my list. I made it, and we met and we reviewed it together, and we talked about my interests and what people are doing, and that was really helpful, and that's why mentorship in this field is so important. And then what we're going to need to do is wait and see who's actually accepting students. So you'll have this huge list. I think I had a crazy number of people, like 20 on my list, and then half of them got crossed off because they weren't accepting students that year. And typically universities will post this throughout August and September, so just keep checking. And if it's not clear, definitely reach out to your potential advisor expressing interest in the program. So I know people have varied views on reaching out just to express interest. I did not do this, and I really regret it. I think you only run the risk of them not responding. In my mind, I was thinking they're going to be annoyed, they don't want to hear from me, but they really do. They want to hear that you're interested. They're excited to hear who's going to be applying to their lab. And so I've included just an example of an email. Again, all these slides are going to come to you guys. You can steal this template if you want. I don't mind at all. But this is just saying, I wanted to check in to see if you're accepting students. I'm really interested, and definitely include your CV. And that way they can review it, and if they have any questions, they can get back to you. It just kind of helps with building the relationship early on, and I think will stand out during the interview process. So like I said, I didn't do this, and I really regret it, so I recommend it.
Allie?
Yeah.
Let me jump in for a second and talk a little bit more about making that list. So when Allie and I were first talking about her slides, she had mentioned that she probably had 3/4 of her list before she even started looking at university web pages. For me, it was a completely different experience. So because I had done some work with social psychology and some of the stuff that I had done undergraduate, I had some ideas about what I wanted to research, but I had no idea who was doing that in clinical psychology. And so for me, it was very much about, okay, this is the idea that I want, and starting to look at the bios. And that helped me really build the list. The other thing I wanted to say is just kind of put in a plug for the PTSD SIG, which, we're sponsoring this webinar because we think it's so important for students to really have some kind of resources. And I will let you know that we are happy to also talk to you about potential mentors. If you have interests, help guide you, or reach out to people that we know. So don't be afraid to speak up. And this is very consistent with what Allie was saying in terms of reaching out. The worst thing that will happen is somebody won't write you back, and that's okay. I wouldn't recommend, blasting them with emails every day, but sending out a friendly email just asking if they're accepting students is completely appropriate and usually welcomed.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle, and I agree with all of those points. Okay, so now to actually just talk about what you'll need for your application. I know for me, there was a lot of anxiety about, is my GPA high enough or my GREs high enough? So hopefully this will help folks with some of that. But a note about organization before you start. As you're making your list, a lot of things are going to overlap in your head. A lot of things are going to blend together with different programs. And I would really, really recommend making a spreadsheet if you haven't already. Here's an example of mine. I just pulled a row from it. I pulled the school I actually ended up going to, but you can see that I have the application deadline, my advisor, their interests, whether or not my transcript sent, minimum GPA and GRE, the institution code for the GRE, personal statement requirements. And I've kind of just, as I was submitting things and completing things, I was updating my spreadsheet along the way, and it really helps, really helps you stay consistent and stay kind of on track. So you can steal the template. I have a full Excel document. If anyone wants it, I'm happy to send that template around. just let me know, but it wouldn't fit on the slide.
Allie, the sound I think is still a little bit off. Sounds like you're in a tunnel, so you might want to get a little closer to the mic.
Okay, how's this?
Meh.
Yeah? Okay. I am on a monitor, so I wonder if that's having something to do with it.
Maybe.
How's this?
So much better.
Okay, great. All right, so the key was opening my laptop. Okay, so let's just start with GPA. Most programs are gonna want a major in psychology. However, of course, if you didn't end up doing that to start, you can always take additional classes, and they might want the psych GRE if you didn't major in psychology. There's some, you could also potentially seek out a master's. The reason this is kind of a contentious issue, and you might want to kind of check to see what your program that you're applying to has done historically. A master's is by no means bad or fatal or anything like that, but typically when you're coming into a PhD program, you're kind of a fresh slate for them to mold your training and to mold habits and to mold your theoretical and your clinical orientation. And a lot of times with people with masters, they've already been trained to some extent. So again, it's not a bad thing. You may just want to check before, if you're thinking about pursuing a master's beforehand, you may just want to check to see historically what kinds of students the program has accepted. Typically, minimum GPA is going to be a 3.0 to a 3.5. This really differs by school. But this application is multifaceted. I would say for sure your research interests, your letters of recommendation, your personal statement, and your research experience are going to be probably the most important. So you can definitely compensate for some of these other things with really strong other elements of your application. And just make sure as you're going through the process that you know how to get your transcripts from your undergraduate institution, and make sure that you send them well in advance. I will say though, with this and with the GRE, be tracking it, make sure that you're sending it, but you can also communicate with the admin departments. This is much different from applying to undergrad. If you realize your GRE score is not being posted, or if you think it might be late, reach out to people. People are really understanding. It's not likely that they're just going to revoke your application, and they'll work with you to kind of make sure you get your materials in on time. So with that being said, every program does require the GRE. Schools will differ on what scores they want and how highly they weight this. I would say some of the quote more competitive programs are going to weigh it more heavily and want higher scores. In general, you want to be above the 75th percentile, but again, there's just a wide range of variability here. The psych GRE is not really heavily weighted, but again, might be important if you didn't major in psychology. And just as an example, I had one school that required the psych GRE. I totally bombed it, like an embarrassing amount, and I still got an interview at that school. I think the other elements of my application really kind of made up for that. And, I had other weighing responsibilities at the time, like work and studying for the general GRE and completing applications. So I wouldn't stress too much. Some schools might require it. You probably want to do better than I did, but it's not going to be a fatal flaw in your application. And again, just make sure you know the GRE code for your school. Similar to transcripts, plan accordingly. Make sure you give yourself 2 weeks after the GRE or in between your GRE and the application deadline to really submit it. So just kind of be timely with that.
And just to jump in here, I think to sort of highlight Allie's point of, when you're in this process, it's so stressful. You've got so many kind of balls in the air, if you will. You're trying to juggle the GREs and getting everything in and writing your essay and figuring out who to work with and making sure your research is good enough. And if anything goes wrong, it's easy to freak out. So I wanted to just share this story. So when I took the GREs, I, had all my school codes. I paid for it with my credit card. I took it, let's say in, I feel like, I don't even know, months before it needed to go in. Well, it turned out that I'd used a credit card that, by the time they needed to send it in, it had been expired, and they didn't charge the credit card immediately. They waited for 6 months until they charged the credit card, and so none of the schools got my GREs, and I missed the deadline for every school I was applying to. So I had to individually contact each of the mentors and say, hey, funny story, true story. And that did not end up hurting me, obviously still ended up getting into graduate school, and I was able to then directly tell people what my scores were. They were very, very nice about it. So what feels like a fatal flaw like that won't sink you completely. Again, these are human beings you're dealing with. If you contact the school, if you contact the potential advisor, explain what happened, show that you're doing everything that you can to remedy the issue, it won't sink your application.
Good point. Okay. So again, with the CV, I'm sure most people are kind of aware of this, but make sure it's professionally formatted. Have your mentor review it. Honestly, that just helps with wording, and your mentor, Michelle, for example, I believe reviewed my CV and remembered something that I had done that I didn't remember. So they have a good sense of the work that you've done. They want to help you get into graduate school, and so definitely have your mentors review your materials. You, again, probably already know this, but you want to include your previous education, descriptive experience about your research, a list of any posters or publications, and any conference affiliations. It's optional to include your references or relevant coursework. I didn't do this. I think I said like references available upon request. And then keep it simple, keep it professional. I've seen some resumes where people put pictures of themselves or a fancy template with colored font. You want to try to generally stay away from that. You'll stand out in other places, like in your research experience and in your personal statement. And I know that it can be really overwhelming, and we're all under the impression that everyone has 1,000 publications and 1,000 presentations. I had a good amount of presentations coming in. I had a few publications. I know people who have been on both ends of the spectrum, having more or less of those opportunities in their post-bac experiences and in undergrad, and they didn't suffer because they were still able to communicate their interests and their experience in an informed way. So I know it seems like it's this super competitive thing and everyone's coming in with all this experience, but I will say, honestly, it's good to have these experiences for sure. You don't need to have 15 publications coming into graduate school. Hopefully that would have eased my anxiety to know in the beginning. Letters of recommendation. So
it's also okay if you come out of graduate school and don't yet have 15 publications. So, I mean, it's really a matter of the quality of the work that you're doing, the fact that you've shown an interest, that you've put yourself out there. You do not have to worry about having a monster CV applying to graduate school. Just something to show that you're serious about research.
Totally. So letters of recommendation, most schools require 3. You want your letter writers to be able to speak to your work and your interests. So of course, you know, your mentors are going to talk about your skills as an RA, your attention to detail, your administrative tasks that you did, but they should also be able to talk about some of the independent projects that you've worked on, the initiative that you've taken. So you really want people that you've worked closely with, PIs whose labs you've been in, postdocs or other collaborators that you've worked on projects with, or other people that have mentored you. I had my undergraduate advisor write me a letter. I had people from the VA write me, and then I had someone else I worked for, an undergraduate, write me a letter. So you can ask from different points in your career. Just make sure that it's people that can speak to your interests and your abilities. And you're going to want to ask your letter writers at least 2 months before the application deadline. So typically that's going to be early October. And then you'll want to follow up. People are busy and they want to support you and they want you to get into graduate school, but they might just have forgotten that they needed to do this. So I would send an email a month later and then follow up about once a week, every week and a half, depending on what you feel comfortable with. And then in your initial email, it's going to be really important that you include your CV, your list of schools with information about how the advisor can submit the letter, and then a description of work that you did in that person's lab, especially if it was a while ago. So when I reached out to my undergrad advisor, I sent her a list of all the things I had done and all my roles in her lab because it had been almost 3 years since I worked for her. So she probably just needed a refresher. And then I think, Michelle, did you want to quickly talk about what you tend to write or what you're kind of looking for when you write letters of rec?
Sure. So I've now written a bunch of letters of recommendation, and I will tell you that when somebody asks me to write a letter, I really think about whether I can write a good letter. And that's something that you should ask. Do you feel like you could write me a good letter of recommendation? Because most of the letters are going to say something at least relatively positive. If you're asking someone who really doesn't know who you are or you got a C in their class, that's going to stand out. If there are things that you've done in their class or while working for them that have gone above and beyond, those are the things that you want to ask them to talk about. So what I will typically ask for when somebody wants a letter of recommendation is obviously their CV, what they're hoping to study, and what they'd like me to focus on in the letter, to get an idea of some of the strengths that they feel they've displayed, but also thinking about things that I can play up in my letter. And the best letters that I have written have been the ones where it's been somebody who has gone above and beyond, and I can actually make a point of something that they've done above and beyond. I wrote a letter for someone several years ago who had helped me format the references on a grant that I was submitting that he was not on. And he had done it over Thanksgiving break because it was due December 1st. And so he had taken time away from his vacation to format these references. And to me, that really spoke to how much this person was willing to go above and beyond, really spoke to his character. And I was able to put that in the letter. So thinking about things like that, I think, can be really helpful. That's also something that I'm looking for. You want your letter writers to be able to speak to your interest in research or your interest in clinical work, concrete behaviors that you've done that are associated with that, and also be able to speak to your character, your maturity, your ability to take feedback. So those are things to be thinking about in terms of asking people, but also things that you want to be doing in your jobs and with the people that you're interacting with so that they'll be able to write about those things.
I totally agree. And I think you make an excellent point that you should definitely clarify when you ask your letter writers, can you write me a strong letter of recommendation? Can you write me a good letter of recommendation? You definitely don't want it to be lukewarm because that will stand out during the application process. So here's a sample email that you could send to your letter writer, and it includes all the things that would be attached on here. And then here's and again, these are in the slides. And then here's an example of a follow-up email that you would send a month or a little bit later. Okay. So personal statement. This is one of your chances to really stand out and show your potential advisor your voice and your interests and your passions for this degree and for your research and for your future clinical work. So it should really reflect your past, like why you're interested in pursuing this field, past experiences that you've had that have led you to these interests and to led you to what you're doing now, what you're currently doing, why this has continued to build on these interests and build on your passion for research and for mental health, and then what you hope to pursue while in graduate school and down the road. So you want to be honest and not speak above your experience. I think we're all still learning and growing, and certainly you know more after you've done a post-bac position than you knew at the beginning, but graduate school is going to be a huge time for learning and growing, and nobody's expecting you to know everything about research when you apply. There are many ways to write a personal statement, so I did mine chronologically. I started with talking about when I became interested in psychology, pursuing research opportunities in undergrad, why I pursued PTSD after graduating, and like what I was interested in doing in the future and in people's labs. And you definitely want to indicate in your statement the mentor that you're interested in working with, what research interests or what research that they do interest you, and kind of how you'd be a good fit in the lab. But you could definitely work from any other point of time. It doesn't need to be chronological. You could start by talking about when you realized what your specific research interests were. You could start by telling an anecdote or a personal story, but I will caution that you don't want to get too personal. You typically don't want to talk about your own mental health or mental health that that has been in your family. And then you definitely want to have multiple people edit and provide feedback to your statements. This is, again, what mentors are for. I had several people look over my statements. It's a really iterative process. And at the end of the day, it should still sound like you. So, people can tweak the wording to make it sound and flow a little bit better. But this is probably one of the few places at this stage in my career where I was actually rejecting people's edits. I was thinking, this doesn't really sound like me. So, and what will come out of that iterative process is just a really nice, refined statement about your interests and about why you want to pursue this degree. And I, again, would really recommend having multiple people look at it. I think I had 11 drafts by the time I was done. And I'm very proud of that statement, so it's worth it.
So, and just to sort of build on what Allie was saying, this is hard. I thought the personal statement was really hard. You'll have to do these kind of statements, something along these lines when you apply for internship. You'll do it when you apply for jobs, and sort of writing a summary of what you do, why you do it, how you fit with the place you want to go. And I think it's really challenging. And coming out of undergraduate, you've never had the experience really writing something like this. So don't get frustrated. I mean, you're going to, but don't let that stop you. And don't be afraid to ask people for feedback. I mean, even when I wrote my internship essays, those got ripped to shreds by everybody who read them, and it made it stronger. It's hard to write about yourself. It's hard to sell yourself. It's hard to talk about yourself in terms of the behavioral accomplishments you've had, and not just, well, I feel like this. And so, give yourself time to write this.
Totally agree. Give yourself time to write this, which kind of leads to this next slide. This is my outline for my personal statement, and I would really recommend putting something together like this kind of as you're doing your list, probably in the next month or so, just to get yourself to really start thinking about the different experiences you've had and how that's really shaped where you want to go. So again, this is just an example of how I did it, and there are many ways to do it, but this certainly helped me in kind of structuring my whole statement. So we've just talked about a lot, and we've mentioned kind of along the way when you should really be starting these different processes, but this timeline is taken and edited a little bit from Sophie Chokas Bradley's guide, which is also in the resource, and is an excellent guide for graduate school as well if you haven't read it yet. But we've hit on most of this, but just for your own personal reference, I would say in the next few weeks, you really want to be deciding, is this the right degree for me, and am I going to be applying right now? And start making your list probably early to mid-September, and then begin contacting advisors as you're noticing that school sites are posting who and who isn't taking students. You'll want to begin your applications probably around October, and honestly, doing the actual application itself is really nice because it's productive. It has to get done, but it's not something that you have to spend a lot of time thinking about. So it's kind of a nice thing to check off. Take the GRE. The general GRE is offered all the time. I would take it by October at the latest. I took mine in November and it was stressful, so it's possible, but maybe just to prevent yourself some of that stress. And then the psych GRE is only offered 3 times a year. If you didn't take it in April, I would really aim to take it in October and just communicate with your program that requires it that that's when you're taking it. I would order your transcripts. I think I started ordering transcripts once I made my online portals for each application, and that was just so that they had a place to go. Basically what happens is you create your application, and as you're sending things in, it links up by your name. And then you want to start your letter of recommendations in early October probably. And like I said, I had 11 drafts of my personal statement. I would begin drafting in late September. You may not need that many drafts or want to do that many drafts. So again, these are all personal. There's a lot of variability, but this is kind of my recommended timeline. And I didn't do all of these things. So this is a reflection also on how to reduce some anxiety and some stress. And then quickly, I will just say, I hit on this a little bit. I know that studying for the GRE while you're working or in school can be really difficult. And I think that's why my psych GRE personally took such a big hit. But what I did, and everybody is different and is productive at different times, but I used to wake up before work and study for about 30 minutes a day for the general GRE. And that really helped for me. And I know for a lot of people, the GRE, it's the timing that's really difficult. And 30 minutes is about the length of a section. So you can often kind of time yourself and go through one verbal or one quant section. And just doing that kind of repetitively for a couple of months was really helpful. And that might be better for you after work or on your lunch break or whenever. But at the end of the day, my brain was mush, so I had to do it in the morning. And so fitting that in is going to be important and is certainly challenging when you're working full time, but it's doable. And it's really about your personal preferences and when you're the most productive.
I would also say there's lots and lots of study materials. One of the things that I did was I took a night class for the GRE, and so probably not helpful for those of you who are planning to apply this fall, but for those of you who are planning to apply later, that was great to sort of get me back into it. And for me, my mind is always mush in the morning. So I would do some studying at night, and I would have like, I even made note cards and I was able to sort of carry them around. They probably have an app now that you can like pull up words and study them that way. Just sort of when you have time just to sort of jog your memory, and you'll be amazed at how much that will improve your score. And then I would make time each weekend, like one day where I would do testing. And that was another way that I was able to sort of make it a regular thing so that when I went in to sit for the GREs, I was used to sitting at a computer and taking a test. You know, it didn't feel so out of normal, which was good.
That's a really excellent point. Taking the GRE practice tests that are offered by ETS were really helpful and probably the closest to the actual GRE. So if you haven't started those yet, I would recommend that for sure. So once you've applied, preparing for interviews is probably the next thing. And for me, I felt so anxious and eager to apply that by the time I started getting interviews, I was kind of like, oh my gosh, what is this going to be like? So it's not as scary as it seems. You'll start getting emails or calls about interviews in December and January. There are limited weekends given that typically we have to make decisions and offers by April 15th that we can actually interview people. So some schools are going to have their interviews on the same day, and some will have alternate days and others won't. I think it's really important if you have a conflict and your school doesn't have an alternate day to approach these conflicts with understanding that like coordinating interviews is a huge task and coordinating an alternate day is a huge task, and just be really gracious for the opportunity to interview. And I will say, like, if you accept an interview and then get an interview from somewhere else and it's on the same day, even if you're more interested in the second program, it's really proper decorum to still go to the first interview. And just to be frank, you know, won't look great if you actually back out. And some advisors will be more understanding of others than others that you have conflicts. Some will be, you know, some are really understanding that this process is hard and that there are limited time slots, and then some won't be as understanding. But just as an example, this is an email that you could potentially send if a scheduling conflict comes up. You know, just really expressing your interest, expressing your appreciation is going to be really important here in navigating these tricky situations because they're not easy. Okay, so once you're actually getting to the point where you're ready to interview, it's definitely much more of a conversation than an interview where you're going to be grilled. I would try doing mocks with your current advisors and mentors. That'll just be really helpful in kind of refining some of your answers and refining your personal story about your research and your interests. Definitely do your homework beforehand. Know what your potential advisors and graduate students are working on now. Read recent publications. You want to be able to talk about how your research fits into the lab without being kind of a carbon copy of what they're already doing. And you want to be able to speak about your research in an informed way based on literature, but you want to strike a balance between having ideas, but also being open and flexible to those ideas changing and to your interests changing in grad school. So it'd be too broad, for example, to say, I want to study PTSD, but maybe too narrow to say, for my dissertation or for this grant application, I want to do this exact study. It's certainly good to have ideas for studies, and that might be something you want to highlight on interviews, but you want to keep your interests more broad than that because probably they're going to change while you're in graduate school. every person that you come into contact with when you're there is part of the process. So the entire interview weekend is evaluative. Even if people are saying, we're not evaluating you, or this isn't part of the interview, it totally is. Be professional, even at the social events. Don't drink too much. We've all heard the horror stories about that. And read between the lines. Look to see how happy graduate students are. You know, nobody is going to say directly to you, oh, my mentor is never here, they're never available. They might say something like, they're extremely hands-off. So not saying that them being hands-off means that they're not available, but you want to definitely be looking to see how happy people are in the lab, and picking up on some of those cues when possible. So I'm happy to talk more about that if people have other questions about that.
And just to sort of add to what Allie is saying, knowing also what you're looking for in a mentor is really helpful here, and having targeted questions that are sort of getting at what you're interested in. So some people work better with a mentor who's really hands-on and is going to sort of be looking over your shoulder. Other people work better with a mentor who's a little more hands-off, where you have a little bit more independence, where you seek them out when you need something. Some people really want a structured interview time, like we are going to meet on this day to discuss X, Y, and Z. Other people are completely happy with popping in whenever they have questions. So think about what you think is best for you and what your learning style is. And then you also want to be asking questions about any potential mentor to see whether or not that style is compatible with the best way you learn.
Totally, and we'll get to some of those questions in a little bit too, but questions that you're probably going to be asked include these different things. And again, that's just being able to talk about your goals and your interests at this point in time. They may ask if you're willing to move to the school that you're at. You might want to have an answer prepared for that. And what populations you're interested in working with. And then anything on your CV is fair game. So try your best to kind of review that and remember the different projects you worked on. Also, technically, when you're interviewing, people are not supposed to ask you where else you've applied, but they will, and they do. And when they do, I would start by keeping it general, saying like, I applied to a wide range of programs. And if they keep pressing or kind of keep asking, make sure that you say programs that other programs you've applied to that are similar research interests. So it really shows that you're interested in researching this topic. That may be what they're trying to get at. Like, do you really want to study PTSD, or are you more interested in studying other anxiety disorders? So I would keep that in mind kind of as you're going along. They're not supposed to ask you, but they probably will at some point. And then I'm not going to spend too much time here. Again, Mitch Prinstein's guide is amazing, and this just kind of dovetails what Michelle was just saying, but come prepared with tons of questions about the mentorship style, about the environment in the lab, and think about your goals. We're back to goals again. You want to ask about all those things so that you're able to evaluate each program based on the criteria that you want it to have. And Mitch Princeton has a lot of amazing questions in his guide. So again, that's in the resources slide. I would definitely look at that. But grad students will be able to speak more to questions like what it's like to live on the stipend, the mentorship style, how the lab operates in terms of publications and presentations and work-life balance and that kind of stuff. And then after interviews, you want to be sure to send thank yous to everyone that you met and stayed with, if that's applicable.
Let me just stop you for 1 second and go back to questions.
Yeah.
So as Allie mentioned, everybody is going to ask you if you have questions, and especially if you end up on an alternate interview day, which happened to me. I interviewed with, I think, 4 faculty members and 3 graduate students for Temple. And so, you know, you run out of questions. Here's the thing. They don't know that. So don't be afraid to ask a question again. A lot of times that will give you a different perspective. You'll get additional information, but never say, nope, I pretty much get everything. You know, just ask again, even if you're asking about their experience, even if you're asking a little bit more about like what it's like to work on a specific study that you've already heard details about, it's going to look good if you do that.
I totally, yeah, no, that's true. You do not want to run out of questions. And Michelle's right, asking again to someone else will just increase your perspective on things. So then, like I was starting to say, after interviews, you're going to want to send thank you emails to everyone that you interacted with or interviewed with and everyone that hosted you. And that's going to be really important. This year was my first year on the other side of the application process, and it was really obvious when people didn't email even within 24 hours after the interview. So I would certainly recommend doing that. And then for your own personal sake, I would take notes right after the interview and you have the opportunity, whether you're at the airport or on the plane. That's what I did. You can add them to your spreadsheet, but just to help keep everything straight, remember the things you liked and you didn't like, because you're going to come back after, all your interviews and say, oh, I can't remember specifics. So I would really recommend doing that, and it will really help you evaluate the programs in line with your goals and interests. So here are just some examples of thank you emails for after interviews. And then how do you decide? So again, everyone has different priorities and goals. Everyone has a different reason for picking a program. But I would ask you to start thinking about your top 3 or 4 priorities going into the interview process. Even though it's not really likely that one program is going to meet all your needs, and you're going to have some push-pull like I did with location versus research fit, it's going to be up to you at the end of the day what you prioritize and what you choose. And so kind of when you're debriefing and when you're taking notes, you want to be thinking about these goals and priorities that you have and rating each of these priorities for each program. So I think I developed my own 1 to 5 scale and rated everything. And then at the end, it was kind of easy to go back and look and see what lined up the best. But that's not going to be the only thing that is informative. Like I said, those other cues, like looking to see if graduate students are happy, looking to see if those opportunities are there, you have to trust yourself too. So even if a program looks excellent on paper, but you were there and you did not get a good vibe, that's going to be informative information for you that you should be keeping track of. And talk it out with someone you trust. Again, we are so lucky in this field that we have mentors that want to support us and want to see us succeed. So after interviews, I talked to a few different people about my different thoughts, and they really helped in making my decision. So I don't think anyone should tell you that your priorities are right or wrong, or that, the reason that you're picking a school is right or wrong, but you need to know going into it, the things that you kind of value and what you're really looking for. And that's it for us. So if anybody has questions, I think we've got about 8 minutes at this point, but like I said, I'm happy to take them on email. But go ahead and chat questions now, and I'll read them back out to the group if anybody has any questions.
Allie, while we're waiting to see if anyone has questions, do you want to talk a little bit about how you weighed the priorities to make your decision in terms of choosing a program?
Yes, absolutely. So I was fortunate in that I interviewed at a bunch of places that were really excellent, and so deciding was really challenging for me. And ultimately for me, it was really, really about research and mentorship fit. And so my current mentor really matched my research interests well, seemed to be really supportive on interview day, meets with her students weekly, which was really important to me, somebody that's really involved, but also allows a certain degree of independence and kind of pursuing your own interests, and then somebody that's really supportive of us applying for grants or of pursuing, like I said, kind of creating our own research trajectories. And that was something I was really looking for. I wanted those kinds of opportunities. So in terms of, for me, I really highly valued mentor fit over program fit, and really valued research interests as well. And like I said, there was some tension with me deciding between location. Case Western is in Cleveland. It's not necessarily close to my family, but at the end of the day, I had to decide that for me, and again, this is a personal decision, but for me, priorities and goals related to career were more important at this time. It doesn't look like anyone has any questions. I hope that last little bit was helpful. Michelle, do you want to talk about how you decided to go to Temple?
Sure. 100 years ago, when dinosaurs still walked the earth, I had done my social psychology program in California, and I loved California. The weather was amazing. I was living in Southern California, and I'd applied to a lot of schools on the East Coast, which is where my family was. And that was a really hard decision to leave California. but similar to Allie, I ended up, and then actually, Allie, I'm going to ask you to unmute everyone because I think people might have questions that we just aren't being able to see. I don't know if you're seeing
Oh
the
yeah,
question.
no problem. Okay, can everybody, I'm unmuting everyone. Can everybody see the waving hand function? If you can click waving hand, then you can ask, I think. I don't know if anyone sees it. Okay, Dawn, why don't you go ahead and ask your question?
Okay.
Dawn? Let's see.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Wait, I'm
can you
getting
hear
the
me now?
questions. I'm so sorry, guys. I see them.
Within the realm of PTSD, is the focus more on veterans, or is there also, say, adolescent support as well?
In PTSD programs specifically, or in my
Yes,
work?
in PTSD specifically.
Okay. So I would say that there are going to be opportunities for trauma work in kids and adolescents. And that's just going to be something that you're going to want to kind of search for on your own. But I can think of a few people off the top of my head. And I'm happy if you want to shoot me an email after this to send you some recommendations for that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so I actually am seeing the questions typed. So I'm going to go ahead and read them. So someone asked, is the personal statement the same thing as a research statement? And it depends on the program. Sometimes you just have to write one personal statement, and sometimes they want a personal and research statement. I would say typically they're going to be the same thing, though. How much did your personal statement differ from one application to the next, considering unique faculty interests? That's a great question. The entire body of my personal statement did not differ, but the last paragraph did differ. I would occasionally take out and replace certain experiences if there was something I wanted to emphasize based on a lab, but in general, the structure of my statement did not change a lot. Do programs require recommendation letters from undergrad in addition to letters from mentors, PIs, etc.? No, not necessarily. If you think that your mentors and PIs could speak better to your experience, I would say you probably don't need letters of rec from people in undergrad.
Sorry, I have a question.
Yeah.
Hi. Okay, so I actually didn't even know the function was working, so I kind of tried it. Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate this. So I am applying this year, and I'm kind of doing I've been doing like a post-bac since last winter and getting involved in research. And my background is not at all in psychology, so this is, a whole transition. But I'm excited about it. Honestly, there's never been a time where I'm like, oh my gosh, this is awful.
I got five.
So I'm really thankful for this. I did want to know, in terms of recommendation, because I feel like, being a part of, a post-bac where I'm just kind of doing my own thing. I've just been taking classes that I knew were applicable to a lot of schools. So, oh, sorry, I can't hear you. I don't know if someone's talking at the moment.
Oh, well, the only thing she said.
Guys, if you guys are not speaking, if you could mute your phone, that would be great.
Thank you. Yeah, so I did want to know, I feel like I haven't had time to not really have time, but the opportunity to really, build or foster great relationship with professors, because I've, just taken, class to class where I know that obviously I try to be as quote unquote stellar as possible, but it's just a different course every semester. I have been doing research with an amazing mentor, for a year now, so I know that obviously it's strong on that end. So in terms of recommendations, being, in this shoe, what would you recommend in terms of, how to go about gaining recommendations? I'm also at an internship right now. It doesn't have to do with psychology, but it is building me professionally. So is there any ever space for that where you're like, okay, professional, recommendation will be, appropriate or, acceptable for programs?
Right. I think generally, and Michelle, if you disagree, let me know, but I think you probably want really to be having your writers be people in the field of psychology. So it sounds like your research
Mhm.
mentor is definitely going to be someone for you. And it does sound like
Mhm.
your courses might be the better route there.
Mhm.
I'm not sure if I would recommend asking someone that's not in the field, but Michelle, do you have a different opinion?
Mhm.
Yeah, I kind of do. It sounds like you are not a traditional candidate, and that's okay. But you want to make sure that anyone that you're going to ask is going to be able to speak to your skills and ability in terms of the program. So, for
Mhm.
example, if you are doing an internship right now, it's not related to psychology, but there are skills that you're learning there, like
Yeah.
managing a research program or, a lot of work with
A project.
communication skills. And
Mhm.
that's something that's going to be very relevant for graduate school. That's the kind of stuff that you would want them to play up. It sounds like your
Okay.
main writer, as Ali identified, is going to be the mentor who you've been working with closely. You might
Mhm.
also want to approach one of your professors who you took those classes with. If you did, if you got an A in that class, and go and talk about, whether that person feels like they could write you a good letter. And then they can spend
Mhm.
some time in the letter talking about the rigorousness of the class and
Mhm.
the assignments that you did, and you can go back and look at the papers that you wrote to remind them.
Right.
That was something
Right.
that I had done actually for, I think, one of my letter writers to my original program in social psychology.
Mhm.
So again, in a perfect world, you would have 3 research people who could write you letters of recommendation. But if
Right.
you don't, that's not necessarily a deal breaker. And again, I would just, make sure that they're playing up the strengths and the ways in which you think the work that you're doing now can really show that you are a good fit for graduate school.
I think that's
Mhm.
great advice, Michelle. And I actually, now that you've said that, do kind of agree with that. Not everybody's coming from the same background with the same experience. So I think it's probably fine to ask your boss, your internship. So we are out of time. We still have a bunch of questions to
Thank
get to.
you.
Yeah, no problem. I'm not sure if we're able to, I mean, I'm happy to keep answering questions if people want to stay on. I don't know if we have a hard cutoff here.
We
Or,
don't. We can keep going for a little while. I'm sure people need to sign off soon. So, Allie, it's at your discretion how much longer you want to take questions. And then Allie has 2 other slides after this, which you'll see when you download the PowerPoint. The next one is references, including Mitch Princeton, which is something that she had mentioned. So feel free to check that out. And the last slide is both of our email addresses. So if you have additional questions and you can't stay for however long Allie's available, then you can always reach out to us individually, and we're happy to help in any way that we can.
yeah, and really just to echo that, if I don't get to your question, just shoot me an email and say, you didn't get to my question, here it is, and I will respond probably sometime this week or this weekend. But I'll stay on for 5 more minutes and answer. I'm going to use the chat function, so um, no need to kind of speak. I'm just going to go through. I figured it out. So we have another question that's how to best go about obtaining letters from professors from undergrad for those who are several years out of college. Great question. I was also a few years out when I applied, so I do believe that I have that email template, and I would just send like another reminder of who you were when you took their class or when you worked with them, and just say, happy to answer questions. They may or may not remember you, but it's good to just give them as much information as you can, I think, about yourself and about the work that you did for them or about how you performed in their course. And particularly if they're also psychologists, they will likely be supportive of you pursuing this degree and will want to help you. Do you have suggestions for ways to build research writing skills? I think that's an excellent question. I would say my personal experience is that I really built up those skills in my post-bac position by taking on some independent projects and by really taking initiative there. So I would think of an idea, and then I'd run the analyses, I'd write the abstract, and I would get feedback from my advisor before I'd be able to present or publish that, and other people's comments and other people's writing and pursuing those independent projects. We're honestly just doing it is the best way.
And Allie, let me just sort of build on that for people who aren't necessarily in that situation. The first thing that I would do is I would go to people who are doing writing, who you think could potentially mentor you, and ask if you can have an opportunity to do it. This is something that I would recommend doing for preparing to go to graduate school, but also while you're in graduate school. My first author paper in graduate school came from me going to my mentor and saying, I would like to write a paper on this. Is that okay? And, will you mentor me through it?
Sorry, I should have mentioned that. It's important to get that kind of blessing first.
And so then getting as much practice and as much feedback as you possibly can. So often people will be very open to allowing you to help them out, to write up stuff. If, you're going to sort of get their work out there, and in exchange, getting some feedback on your writing is helpful. The other thing I would do is keep in mind that undergraduate writing is very, very different than research writing. And so look at how the articles that you read are written. Look at the verbs that are used. Look at the fact that it's very rare to say I, and if you do, it's not I think, it's I did. So you really want to be thinking about the kind of language that's being used in papers that are in print. Not very flowery, really to the point as much as you can. And that should also help with that.
So the next question is, what are some ways to get good research experience? Sorry, I lost it. I have volunteered in labs but didn't do any presentations, etc. Is this type of experience useful? Absolutely. Other RA experience that isn't just these independent projects is going to be extremely useful and really valued by your graduate mentors. It shows that you have attention to detail, that you can work on a team, that you're willing to do these kinds of tasks and to coordinate studies, and that's all stuff that's going to be really important in graduate school. So like I said, I have some friends that applied that had a couple of posters on their CV and they were still able to get in. I really think it's still about your interest and your experience. And of course, if you can secure a couple of posters or a paper, it's just going to strengthen you. But really building up your research interests and being able to speak about them is going to be really, really important.
Exactly right. Put it on your CV, put it in the letter, and make sure that you can talk educatedly about what you did. And that will be great.
So unfortunately, I have to run. I know that there are still some questions. Like I said, I'm really open to answering them still. I really wanted to try to get to them. There was just a lot of content to get to. And I know that this time is stressful and that you really want these questions answered. So at the end of these slides, I'll just put it up now so people can see my email and they can copy it down in case they're having a hard time for some reason downloading the slides. But these are our email addresses. Please reach out with your question if I didn't get to it. And thank you all for coming. I hope that this was useful and helpful. That was really the purpose. And thank you so much, Michelle, for being on and for adding about your experience and giving your advice as someone that's definitely more senior than I am. It was really helpful.
Yeah, and good luck, everybody. And please let us know if anything we can do to help.
All right. Have a good one, everyone.
Bye.